Welcome back, bow hunters. This is Ron with Stay Sharp Guys. In this sharpening video, we're looking at the Swacker 252 razor 4-blade head. This is a large head, 1.5 inches wide, and it's got some challenges in that it's got a rather stout main blade but a super thin bleeder blade. The bleeder blade is single bevel, only sharpen on one side, and there is a hefty burr. I can even catch my fingernail on it. And the main blade is double beveled, so we have to come up with a strategy to sharpen this. Now, in most of my videos, I will show you a new head and we will get a sharpening or a sharpness benchmark. This head happens to be a used head a viewer sent me, and it's very used, and he attempted to sharpen it and didn't complete the task. And you can see where he was rounding it off, so there's going to be some material removal here. Not to mention we got to fix a slightly concave edge that he created here, so we have to take care of all that. I think before we go any further, I should get a weight because there's going to be some material to remove here. So let's do that. It's supposedly a 100 grain head, so we will put all the components on the scale, and it says 100 grains. So that is a 100 grain head, and we should hope to have it be 100 grains when we are done. I believe I should be able to slide the blade, off and off to take it apart. So next we will look at what sort of a sharpening strategy we're going to use for this blade. Before we figure out how to sharpen this incredibly dull head, we should get a benchmark to see what sort of an edge we're dealing with. That is dull. That is a seriously rolled edge. Now let's look at the bleeder blade. Since we're going to be sharpening that as well, let's get a benchmark on that. And both sides seem equally dull. Wow, and that has a burr that I can literally hang my fingernail on. That's why I tell people, make sure you've gotten rid of the burr. That folded over flap of metal can sure make it seem like it's rounded off and dull. So make sure you get rid of the burr. So there you have it. That's our starting point for the main and the bleeder blade. Those edges looked incredibly bad under the microscope and in the sharpness meter. So we've got our work cut out for us here. In this case, the main blade and the bleeders, I think the best choice is probably our replaceable blade guide. This is the amount of exposure for the main blade. Now in other videos where I sharpen new heads, I talk about matching the factory angle. The owner of this head attempted to sharpen it, so there is no factory angle left at this point. But nevertheless, we still color it up with a Sharpie marker because we want to see what the lay is, or the positioning in the guide. So we're going to start out with a 240 grit plate because this head is really in bad shape. So we'll give it a couple of light rolls here just to see. So I would say yes, we could probably come into the guide. We're hitting mainly on the back. If you hit mainly on the back, that means you can bring the blade into the jaws a bit, so I will go ahead and do that. Now we're more into the body of the blade, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. The key is you want the blade to lay down and hit the entire edge. Let's exaggerate it and say it was hitting here first. Well, logic suggests you push that in or you pull this out to make it lay flat. You want the entire blade hitting, not teetering. So when I roll it, this is what I get. So with that positioning, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sharpen up 240 grit, get a burr up on this side. I will flip it, get a second burr, and then I'm going to come back and talk about the burr, breaking it off, and other aspects of sharpening this head. I started sharpening on this side of the blade, and I noticed that the person that tried to sharpen it really rounded it off at the very tip. So I'm establishing a new straight flat bevel, but you can see where he rounded it off at the actual cutting edge. Then I started looking at the other side, and I see that it's considerably worse. He's really rounded it off in this region here. So I'm going to be taking quite a bit of material off to correct that, and eventually this bevel will meet this bevel, and all of that waviness and irregularity will go away when they meet. So I will keep sharpening. I've been sharpening on this head for a while now, and it's clear that there's a real depression in there, and I think that was caused by the attempt to sharpen. So I'm going to be achieving a burr here and out here, but right here it's deeper than the rest of the blade. So until I get that gone and essentially straighten up this entire edge, I won't be able to get a burr along the entire other side. So I'll keep going. Well, this blade was challenging because of the attempts by the user to sharpen it before he sent it to me. And so let me explain the compound issues we have here. The edge was not straight. There was a depression in here. I have to remove the material in a straight line to the deepest point to get rid of that depression. To compound that, when he tried to sharpen it, he really rounded it off. Well, in order for me to get a burr here, I have to remove all of this material here, get a burr, and then remove material here to get my second burr. So it took a while at 240 grit, but I believe we've straightened the edge out, which was very crooked, and we've gotten rid of that rounded off shape, and now the paper catches along the entire length. So the burr causes the paper to flex and pops over it, and that is your signal to then either flip it over and sharpen it, but I've already sharpened the other side, so I've gotten one burr, and now I've achieved my second burr at 240. So I will get rid of both burrs at 240 with some alternating strokes just to bend that burr back and forth enough to get rid of it. And then it's going to be time to switch from 240 to 400. But before we can tackle 400, we have to get rid of all of the debris that's on the rollers, that's on the blade. So I'm going to clean this up a little bit. Make sure I don't carry over any 400 grit debris from this sharpening session to the 400 grit plate. And even then, I'm going to take the 400 grit plate, tap it, make sure it's clean. And now we're going to get a burr on this side and then flip it over, get a burr on the other side. So we're going to create two burrs with 400 grit, and then I'll be back. I've sharpened one side at 400 grit. I flipped it over. This is the second side. Now we want to check for the burr with a piece of paper. See how the paper flexes, then it pops off the burr. You need to get that along the entire edge. So here it is at the tip, middle, all the way along. You need that burr. So now that I've got two burrs with 400, I'm going to break that 400 grit burr off. And our next grit is going to be 800, but before we switch to 800, again, we want to clean off the guide, get rid of all of that 400 grit diamond that may have come off, any of that grit that we do not want to transfer to the 800 grit plate. And now we will start with 800 grit. I'll get a burr on this side, flip it over, and come back and talk about the second burr. For as long as it took me to do 240 to restructure that edge, 400 was far shorter. 800 is even quicker. It took very little time. So let's check for a burr here. Our paper is flexing and popping. That means we have raised the burr on both sides. We're getting a very good looking and now straight edge. So let's break off 800 burr now on both sides. Ensure that there's no burr left. We saw what that burr looked like on that bleeder blade at the beginning of the video. A burr is a sharpness destroyer if it's left behind. Alright, after 8 we go to 12. But before we can do 12, let's clean this up. Make sure we get rid of all the debris. And where is my, here it is, 1200 grit. Make sure we knock all that off. We'll use a different towel. Wipe that plate off. And the same thing. I'll get a burr on one side, I'll flip it over, get a burr on the other side, and then we'll come back. We're to our second burr now at 1200 grit, and I failed to mention it yet, so I'll do it now. Don't push down hard on your diamond plates or your wet dry sandpaper. A thumb, a middle finger, an index finger, almost as if you're floating. You're not trying to take anything off. Barely push down at all. The quickest way to wreck your diamond plates and your sandpaper is to push down hard. Don't push down hard. You think you're going to get done quicker, you think you're going to take off more metal. That does not happen. It just wrecks your diamond plates, wrecks your sandpaper. So a light touch is all you need. So we are going to check for our second burr at 1200 grit. So long as the paper stops, flexes, catches on that burr, we know we've achieved it. Let's go ahead and break off the 1200 grit burr before we move on to 2500. Let's leave no burr on this blade. That'll be picked up by the sharpness tester. That'll be picked up by the magnifying glass, or I'm sorry, the microscope. We don't want any burr remaining. That will spell disaster for sharpness. All right, that was 1200. Let's clean up this guide. And we're going to switch to 2500, which is here. And again, give it a couple of taps, make sure there's nothing on there. And we will do 2500 grit 2 times. A burr on this side, flip it, a burr on the next side, and then we'll come back and talk about that. Alright, so we probably have a burr at this point. I will check it, but one of the questions that I get is, how do I know when my diamond plates are wore out? Well, if you've watched these videos at all, you've probably noticed this blemish plate with the shiny spot here. I use all my factory seconds and blemishes for myself. They're just fine. They work great, but I won't sell them because they have a little blemish on them. But people say, man, you know, my plate feels smooth. Well, they're going to feel smooth. One way to check is with a fingernail, like scratching fingernails on a chalkboard. If you get that eking, screeching sound, your plates still have life in them. What they may be is simply dirty. So wipe them off, blow them off with compressed air, use an old toothbrush. Don't use water or oil, but just wipe them clean, and that's all you need to do. To check for the burr, we will again use our small piece of Post-it note, slide it on the edge. It flexes, it bends, it catches. That is our signal that we now have 2 burrs at 2500 grit. Now we want to get rid of the burr at 2500 grit. Leave no 2500 grit burr behind. And then we're going to move on to a buffing compound. But before we do that, we will clean up the guide again. Make sure there's no debris from 2500 or any other grit that we're going to take over to buffing. So I will do that next. At this point we're going to talk about buffing. I'm a fan of cardboard, cereal box cardboard, instant rice cardboard, instant mashed potato cardboard. You don't need to invest in a leather strop, otherwise you own the cleaning of that leather strop. If you use free cardboard from food containers, when they get gunked up and impacted, like this one is close to being, you can just throw it away. You were going to throw away this box anyway, use it as a strop, then throw it away once it gets dull or impacted. If you have a leather strop, then you have to clean it, get rid of all that blackened gunk, redress it. I just as soon not do that. Eat another box of minute rice, corn flakes, and I will have another strop to sharpen broadheads on. So the method is backwards lift, backwards lift. You can't push forward with this. You'll cut the strop, you'll scrape off the buffing compound, lift and pull back. Now you see here I'm getting a little bit of buildup that can come right off with your fingernail. You want to get rid of that, otherwise it just rides on that high point. So match your stroke count. You're not going to feel a burr even with paper, so don't even bother trying to feel for a stropping burr. But if you keep doing these flopping strokes, you will be bending it back and forth and eventually breaking it off. You really can't overdo stropping. Do it as much as you'd like, but it really produces a nice edge in the sharpness tester, on the microscope, and on the bleedy things you're trying to cut in the animals you hope to bring down. So I'm going to continue this process of stropping, and then we will look at it under the microscope. That edge looked incredibly smooth and polished, and was no burr remaining. So let's see what we get for a score. .105. That is a very sharp edge. Now, before we go on to the other side, I think I'm going to make a change in that I am going to sharpen the other half of this blade with the gray guide. And the reason for that is the other side of this blade has just as much damage, and I think if we sharpen at a slightly steeper angle, instead of 20, 23, we won't be resurfacing this entire slope, this entire edge. And we will certainly get done quicker and no doubt make it just as sharp, but we will be spending less time sharpening, get a little bit stronger edge. So we will go there next. So we've had some good images under the microscope and excellent sharpness. Here is the edge that I produced. Here was the edge that the original owner sent, and you can see how rounded off it is up here and here. It's very convex. Now he didn't touch much in the center, but this blade is severely rounded off on this side, and there was some rounding taking on back here at the corner. So I'm going to switch now to the gray guide from the replaceable blade guide to do this half of the edge. As I said, for the second half of this blade I'm going to use the gray guide. It's a little steeper angle, it'll be a little less sharpening, it'll probably produce the same results, but this edge, as you can see, was kind of murdered by an attempt at sharpening freehand, I think. So I've got Sharpie marker on there. Let's see what the wear looks like with the gray guide. Right, so it's going to be very wavy because of this hand grind that was done. Let's check the other side. Same thing. It's really rounded off on the end. So I'm not going to be stopping at each grit, at each burr. I'm going to go right from 240 to 400, 8, 12, 25 buff, and then we'll look at it on the sharpness meter before we go on to the bleeder blade. Here is the head sharpened on the gray guide. You can see a longer bevel exposure on the left. That's from the replaceable blade guide. And here is the exposure on the right for the gray guide. Let's see what our score is. '81. Very sharp. It is my conclusion then that the gray guide is the preferred sharpening tool for this head. Next I will look at the bleeder and I will tackle that with the gray guide as well. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of the grits, all of the burr breaking for this tiny bleeder. I will say that it is rather rounded off. It's convex. I'm going to sharpen it with all the grits. At each grit, when I do get a burr, I need to break that burr off. So the burr breaking for a single bevel is to lay it flat and slide it along the plate. You do not want to introduce any bevel on the back side of a single bevel. The other option is to make the blade a double bevel. Sharpen this side, sharpen this side. I contend there's no purpose in having a single bevel when the main blade is double bevel. So that is entirely your option. I'm going to follow what they did. I'm going to keep it a single bevel, but the method to break off the burr on a single bevel is to lay it flat and slide it. So I'll go through all those steps and then we'll come back and we'll look at the sharpening next. I would be remiss if I did not talk about the burr on a single bevel. So you're always only sharpening this side until you get a burr, and here we are at 2500 grit, and we catch and flex and pop over that. The burr breaking at each grit is laying the blade flat and sliding it along the plate. Now if you're doing this with sandpaper, you have to bring your sandpaper all the way to the edge of a piece of plexiglass or old mirror or some sort of a smooth surface. But you do need to get rid of the burr on the single bevel without introducing a bevel on the back side, and that's the process for doing it. Now when I've got the burr broken off, I will create a new little bit of burr at 2500 grit. I will break that off. Now when I get to the buffing compound next, it's the exact same process. Buffing compound will only be a backward stroke, and you can do that on the buffing compound cardboard as much as you want. When you get done with buffing, come back to the 2500 grit plate and break off that tiny buffing compound burr. So I'll do some buffing compound and then I'll look at it under the microscope, and then we will see how sharp we got the bleeder from its very dull stage. So we've got our bleeder blade single beveled using the gray guide. Everything's cleaned up on the back side. We had no burrs or nicks. So let's see what we get for a score here now. So as you can see, it's a little bit longer bevel than what they initially had on there, but there is no issues with that. $81. So that came out very sharp compared to where we were. So that's the process for sharpening the single bevel bleeder. Now, as I said, I contend you could make this a double bevel. You wouldn't be removing much material to do that. I leave that entirely up to you, but the gray guide works with that as well. Here is what our completed head looks like. You can see the cleaning up of the burr on the single bevel portion. Removes that black oxide coating, just oil it. But we now have a nice single bevel on the bleeders. A very sharp double bevel with an incredibly low score for sharpness, which is what we want. This head was essentially useless. It couldn't, shouldn't have been used for hunting at all. But we have now returned it to being a very lethal head. The last question is, how much weight was lost? And again, we took off a lot of material here. We really restructured the main blade and re-beveled the single bevel. So let's see what that did. We went from 100 grains to 94, so a total of 6 grains. Not enough to really worry about, but if you do, there is a really simple solution in the way of weight washers. Weight washers get us right back up to the 100 grains, and there are many sellers of these sorts of weight washers. And they're good to have, actually, to put on the back of the arrow, between the nock and the shaft, on the front of the arrow in this case, so you can play with your dynamic spine, but it's very easy to put weight washers on and get back any weight that was lost. So we've taken a head that was useless and made it hunt ready once again. And in this case, it was the gray guide used for the bleeder, and the gray guide should be used for the main blade. Thanks for watching.